patriotism, faith, national unity, education, fiscal responsibility, civility, the values that define America. Fascinating stories and talks from America-loving patriots dedicated to preserving freedom, opportunity, and justice. Welcome to the Friends and Fellow Citizens podcast. Hello all, and welcome to episode 140 of Friends and Fellow Citizens. I'm your host, Sherman. Thank you all so much for joining me for this interview episode. Today I'll be reconnecting with a fellow Bush School alumnus, so this will be a bit of a catch-up with a guest, so be sure to tune in just a few seconds. Before we get to that, though, of course, a big shout-out to our Patreon supporters. They are absolutely amazing. The support they give is so critical for this show. If you've been listening for a while, or if you'd like to pitch in right now, be sure to check out the link down in the show notes below to see the benefits of being a Patreon member. I've got a new shipment of merch coming in, so you know what's coming up, especially those who are our Patreon supporters. So be sure to check that out down in the show notes below. Also, if you'd like to subscribe to our email list, but you can also do that as well down in the link below. Got a bit of a new format going on. I'm trying this new format for our email subscription so that we become a bit more parsimonious, but also be more informative and help reward those who subscribe to the email list. I'd love to hear from you all on some feedback, anything you have, any suggestions. So be sure to go to georgewashingtoninstitute.org. You can go to the contact page and you can send me your suggestions and thoughts. Today's episode will feature Trent Spoolstra. Trent Spoolstra is the Associate Regional Director for the Midwest Office of the Anti-Defamation League, in charge of young leadership development and Jewish community relations. He leads the region's young leadership class called the Glass Leadership Institute, assists with the ADL Associate Board, sets up adolescent training sessions to counter antisemitism, and runs the region's signature synagogue program. Before coming to ADL, Trent worked in AmeriCorps Vista and was a high school history teacher in Texas. He holds a bachelor's degree in political science from Notre Dame and a master's degree in international affairs from the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University. Obviously, that's where I met Trent, and let's dive right into the conversation. All right, everyone. Well, I am very excited to have my friend Trent Spoolstra onto the program. Trent, it is so great to reconnect, and thank you so much for being on the program today.
Absolutely, Sherman. Thank you for having me. It's good to see you're doing well, and it's great to see that you have this podcast together. And it's a pleasure to be interviewed today.
Well, I want to get started with, of course, the Bush School connection, but I'll first start with a bit about your background. So tell us a bit about who you are and how you really got interested in public service here.
For sure, absolutely. So I'm from Indiana originally, so born and bred Hoosier. Went to Notre Dame for undergraduate, where I studied political science, and really from I think a combination of my time at Notre Dame, receiving a Catholic education, and then eventually moving on to Texas A&M, where we went to the Bush School together. It was very much instilled about working for the common good and doing something that is more important than yourself, and doing something that is going to make the world a little bit better. And so it was ingrained for me, even really from a young age, whether I would volunteer at various places or got involved in extracurricular activities in middle school and high school. My parents really instilled in me the value of serving the public and doing something worthwhile. So really from a young age, I knew I wanted to do something in public service. And so ended up going to Texas A&M for grad school. And of course we had I joke now, it's funny now, at the time not so much, but we had the distinction of graduating into the worst pandemic in a century. And so in terms of not a whole lot of not a lot of job opportunities that arose there, but actually ended up working out. I taught high school history in Houston, Texas for a year, and then eventually worked for the Anti-Defamation League, which I've been here now for about 2.5 years.
That's awesome. And Trent also was one to help me overcome my fears of door knocking when it came to the campaign for our fellow colleague, fellow Bushy Trent Sutton. And so I've sometimes I get both of you confused, but other times I just realize, okay, who's got the cooler beer? No, I'm just kidding.
The other Trent would agree that he does. I would as well too. But yeah.
A great guy, and obviously Trent and I, we worked together on the door knocking campaign just before the shutdowns happened. Actually, this was early 2020 when we had a congressional essentially primary for the Republican Party. And anyway, I just want to say Trent has been so great to keep in touch with. And let's talk a bit about the Bush School now. So we often say that the Bush School is kind of a bit of a corny place, but kind of a good corny in the sense that we value public service. And one of those things, of course, is public service is a noble calling. What can you tell us just about your experiences there and the reflections you've had now closing 4 years since graduation?
That's wild, and it's. I can tell you now. I mean, coming to A&M, I remember when I applied. It was early 2018, and I had applied to the Bush School for the master's degree in international affairs. But I had actually also applied for two MBA programs at Notre Dame and at Indiana University. I was very fortunate to be accepted to all three, but no doubt A&M was number one on my list because I knew I wanted to go to a school that really valued public service, that really valued a career either in government or the nonprofit sector or doing something super worthwhile. And so I remember receiving the acceptance letter from A&M, and I was just excited. I knew I lived at that point. I had lived in Indiana my entire life. I had never lived in another state, so I was excited to go south for at least a couple of years and live in Texas and experience A&M culture and specifically the Bush School. And so for me, when I look back at my years at the Bush School, and obviously still a young guy, hopefully I have many more years to live, but I think they were probably the two best years I've had in my life so far. Between the education I received, the environment of living in College Station, which is just a special place. I know it can seem cultish to a lot of people outside who aren't familiar with it, but between the education, between the people I met like you and others in our class, the education I received, I mean, it was a super worthwhile experience. It was unfortunate that COVID hit the last like 2 months of our 2 year term, but outside of that, it was at this point in my life the two best years that I've had in my life.
Trent, well, first of all, thanks so much for sharing about the Bush School. And as you know, several faculty and alumni have come on this program. So it's always kind of a tradition to get our fellow Bushies together and to reminisce about those times, but also look forward to the future. And I certainly share that too. Let's talk about the main topic here. And of course, you work for the Anti-Defamation League. That is such a critical role. And of course, we'll be discussing the main issues here, but the topic we're discussing today obviously wouldn't be as salient as it is now. It always has been salient, but especially nowadays in foreign affairs, without the tragic attack of October 7th that occurred when Hamas launched a really, really terrible terrorist attack against Israel. This is a hard topic. Obviously, I know people listening will feel very emotional about this. But Trent, I'd just like to ask for your immediate reaction when you first heard about the news on the attack against Israel on October 7th of last year.
Absolutely. I still remember it very, very well. So I'm Jewish myself, and usually working for the ADL, we have a joke that ADL stands for all day long, meaning that we work around the clock with ADL with various tasks, right? So I mentioned I'm Jewish because from Friday afternoon through Saturday night, I may not be fully Shabbat observant or Sabbath observant, but I do really try not to work. That's my one day off to relax, to catch up on sleep, to, if the weather's nice, go outside, things like that. So I remember I had slept in like I normally do on Saturday, and I woke up and I knew something was up when our CEO, Jonathan Greenblatt, sent out an organization-wide email. That was my Saturday morning, and I read it, and I remember, seeing that, developing news going on in Israel right now. We'll be in touch, and I didn't know what was going on, so I immediately went to my living room. I turned on the TV, turned on CNN, and I was on my couch for the rest of the day. In terms of just watching the latest updates, in terms of what was going on, and trying to wrap my head around what had happened. I was 10 years old when 9/11 happened. So I mean, I have still a decent memory, right? But from a kid's perspective, I didn't fully understand what was going on. So this was like, at least for me, it was like a 9/11 part two, where as an adult, I could fully grasp what was going on, the implications, what it would mean for the future. And so what was very touching was, we speak about fellow Bushies. I actually had a couple of our classmates reach out to me that day because they know I'm Jewish. They know I'm very pro-Israel, and they asked me, how are you doing? And how are things going? I had other family members reach out to me as well that day because they know the work that I do. And it was interesting in the sense that I knew after October 8th, my work at ADL was going to shift. The focus, I mean, we're very much focused on fighting anti-Semitism, but I knew that was going to be the core of our mission, and almost 100% of what we were going to do going forward. And I remember, I set my calendar pretty far in advance, and I had tasks to do that Monday. So it would have been October 9th, of things that, like, follow-up stuff I didn't get done that previous week. That stuff didn't get done. It was not a complete 180, but definitely a shift of whatever I was working on previously, like that took the back burner. And in terms of being there to work with fellow Jewish communities, and being there for the Jewish communities here in the Midwest to show that we were in support of Israel, we were in support of them, and then having to unfortunately deal with the sudden dramatic rise in anti-Semitism that happened literally the day after this October 7th terrorist attack. So I tell people, next to being a first-year teacher during COVID, and I love teaching, but those first few months, I didn't know what I was doing as a teacher. I can admit that now that I'm out of the profession. That was the hardest thing that I've had to do. The period between October 8th and about the holidays was the second most stressful time in my entire career, in my adult life, of just day in and day out grinding and putting out all these fires and trying to be, multiple places at once. I mean, it was very chaotic. Thankfully, it has slowed down since Christmas and Hanukkah and the New Year holidays, but ADL is still full steam ahead.
It's really touching to hear your side story. I knew that you were Jewish too, and of course, that's one of the reasons why I wanted to reach out at this time, not just have you on the podcast anytime, but especially in this day and age when we really need people like you and people at ADL. What was it like between, let's say, the attack and, I guess, up to recently? You mentioned that it's lessened a little bit. Obviously, the mission's still there, but tell us a little bit about what it was like, especially as you probably heard a lot of stories from fellow ADL members and Jewish people around the country, around the world, share their stories about what they've encountered. What can you just tell us about what that was like?
I mean, if I had to sum it up in one word, it was intense. I mean, to give you an idea, I do a lot of different tasks for ADL, so I could do anything from holding an event to presenting to, once a month I might travel to one of our states. We cover 9 states across the Midwest. That 6-week period, I went to 4 to 5 states, to either attend events with fellow Jewish community members, to present. There were a couple of times I gave reports. Another example, so ADL tracks incidences of anti-Semitism when folks report into us. In a normal week, we might have maybe 10 to 12 folks of anti-Semitic incidences. From October 8th through really Christmas, we averaged about 35 to 40 per week. And they ranged anywhere from incidences at K through 12 schools with students, to things happening on college campuses, to people saying their employers were crossing the line from legitimate criticism of Israel to anti-Semitism, range anywhere from harassment or vandalism, even of Jewish institutions on college campuses. Nationwide, there were examples of assaults against Jewish individuals or Jewish college students. I'll put it this way. At ADL, we track extremist groups on both the far right and the far left of the political spectrum. we knew what the far right was capable of, especially over the last few years with various events or neo-Nazis and Klan members and things like that. We knew people on the far left were extreme, but it's almost like October 7th was the spark that needed to really get them galvanized to get going. And the rhetoric that we're hearing from on college campuses here in Chicago, there's been at least one. I call them anti-Israel protests, really, because it gets pretty bad almost every single weekend since October 7th. Actually, as of this recording, there's a ceasefire resolution happening in the city of Chicago City Council, and we're going to see how well that turns out. But it was just incredibly intense, and I try to use the analogy with folks. I know in anybody's job, we all have fires we have to put out. Right? And maybe there's just a few fires each week, and it's manageable. For me, at least, from October 8th, really for like through the holidays when it finally slowed down, there were days it felt like the entire forest was on fire, and you didn't know where to go. You didn't know which fire to put out first because it felt like everything was just in your face and super intense, and there was not a break. So it was very intense. Thankfully, now after the holidays, things have slowed down a little bit. They're much more manageable, but it was all hands on deck. It was round the clock, trying to be here, trying to be there, trying to travel this event, do this presentation, answer this incident. There's a lot going on in a very short amount of time.
Well, I really admire your work ethic, especially when something that this personal and this urgent, that urgency that was happening. And I would still say that urgency is still there. It just maybe kind of in a different form in terms of response and whatnot, in terms of long-term solutions, which we'll talk about later. Thank you for sharing that. And I'm sure it's really hard to share this kind of experience. One thing that you mentioned, far right and far left, this kind of leads to my next question, but I like to start with the horseshoe theory, which basically essentially states that the far right and the far left are actually quite similar, that they're rivals, but they share a lot of common characteristics. And this kind of leads me to, of course, the big question: what do you think are some of the factors that are leading to this contemporary rise in anti-Semitic behavior? And do you think it's been just underneath the surface for so long that we just kind of noticed it on October 7th? Or do you think that there's also kind of a reactionary element where it allows the far right and the far left to show their real colors?
Yeah, for sure. And I'm familiar with the horseshoe theory, and from my personal experiences working in this field, I completely agree with it because it makes a lot of sense. The rhetoric that specifically around Jews and specifically around Israel, there are times it's scary where you can hear a far right group and a far left group say basically the same thing when it comes to Jews and when it comes to Israel. And it seems to me that yeah, they're polar opposites, but in the sense that both people, like both extremes, have very simplistic mindsets and they have very simplistic, almost binary views of the world. Now they're different depending on how you look at the far left and the far right, but very simplistic, very susceptible to conspiracy theories, very intense, very passionate about what they do. And while one side may target certain groups and one targets the other, one thing I've found on both the far left and the far right that they can agree on is that oftentimes they don't like Jews and they hate Israel. Those two things that they can definitely agree on. And so, to answer your question, why are we seeing this rise? It's hard to pinpoint exactly. I wish I could give you a simple answer, and I can't. But at ADL, we think there are a few different things going on. So I think first looking at, and I'm not a psychologist, and I mention this to a lot of folks that I can't theorize, but it seems to me in society when it feels like times are falling apart or we're going through a massive societal change that a lot of people don't like, people want to find a scapegoat. They want to find answers for why it feels like their life or their society is falling apart or why times are changing and it's changing in a wrong direction according to them. And that can be anything from, we look at the last two presidential elections that regardless of your viewers, whether they lean left or right, were both very contentious, very controversial, very heated. Of course, we're in a presidential election year this year. We're going to see how November turns out. I imagine it's going to be controversial again. Coming off of 2020, I think, 20, 30 years from now, when we look back at U.S. history, I think 2020 is going to be a year similar to like 1968 in terms of just a lot of things were happening in society all at once that a lot of people were scared and a lot of people were fearful, whether it was the murder of George Floyd and the subsequent protests and a few cases riots that broke out as a result of his murder. Of course, COVID. It was the worst pandemic that we've experienced in a century. Very few people are alive today that experienced the one in 1918 that caused millions of people of death. So there's been a lot happening in the last several years of this country that has made people scared and upset and unsettled. And people want answers, and they think it has to be somebody's fault. And that's usually when people start grabbing at straws, so to speak. They start becoming susceptible to conspiracy theories. They start asking, well, who's in charge? Right? Who's doing all this? And you can go online, whether it's social media or websites or whatever, and you're a few clicks away from finding the Rothschilds or George Soros or this or that. And people say, aha, it's the Jews. They're up to no good because they control the banks, right? And I'm being facetious, right? But people say, they control the banks, they control U.S. foreign policy, they control the media, they control Hollywood. It's their fault that all this is going on. And we've seen this happen throughout Jewish history over thousands, a couple thousand years. We have seen these waves of anti-Semitism peak and dive when tough economic times or tough societal times are taking place. We see increases, not just in anti-Semitism, but all forms of hatred against marginalized groups. It's the other. It's their fault that all these things are taking place in our society.
Well, very well said, especially when you were discussing those different elements about the different the polarized opposites. I do think that one of the problems we have in our politics today is we regard the left and the right as somehow one side's so-called better because it's closer to our side, whereas the other side is even worse. In fact, both sides are bad. And then if you look at the origins of left wing versus right wing, had something to do with where people were sitting in the French Parliament, or at least in the French legislature. It really has nothing to do with that larger goal of trying to win the battle of ideas. And I want to get to a bit more into the workings here of where we've come today. I mean, let's look at, for example, this is when I first saw the news and of course the coverage. It was especially coming from someone who is on a college campus, and here at the University of Alabama, we haven't had a whole lot of really any sort of activity, thank goodness, on anti-Semitic behavior and whatnot. But it's so saddening to see what is happening, especially with those big institutions like Harvard and others. And we've obviously you recall that hearing that involved the major university presidents. If we were to take that just as an example, what does that say about the state of education? And it's hard to even say education because of what we've seen. But what would this say about the state of higher education as an institution within our republic, and why there's still so much work that needs to be done in order to ensure that we do have a campus where we can have free speech and debate, but also that we hold dear the values of treating people equally.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you look at universities, and I was going to say, consider yourself lucky at University of Alabama, because especially here in the Midwest, we have some similar other top institutions where it's been the complete opposite, right? Where it's like students have taken multiple times to campus, taken to the streets, taken to campus, harassing Jewish students, institutions, things like that. In a way, it was, when that hearing was held, it was horrendous how tone deaf and how it was almost like emotionless the university presidents were to a very simple question, which is calling for genocide of Jews, is that against conduct? And they said, well, gave a very legal answer. Well, it depends, and there's this and that. Like, I'm sure at least a couple of them now have since resigned, right? We'll see what happens with the third. I'm sure if they were to go back, they should have said, first of all, it's horrendous when anybody says that, or any forms of hate, or calling for any forms of genocide. Of course, we can condemn that. And then they probably should have given their legal reasoning or free speech. I think that would have made sense. But just to go just went right over the head. I just did not care. Did not look good. And I think symbolized how in a way, a double standard that exists on college campuses right now. I think the last few months have shown that perfectly. Where here at ADL, we've argued this, where if it was almost any other marginalized group, hearing students yell certain things, universities would have condemned it immediately. But because it's Jewish students, and I think in the United States, the perception of where Jews fit in American culture, oftentimes, especially on the far left, there's this view that all Jews are white, which we're not. That we're super privileged, that we're all rich, right? It goes into these old stereotypes, these old tropes. Every once in a while you'll hear somebody like admit it, and I appreciate that. But oftentimes you know what they're thinking, which is, why are these Jews complaining? You're white, you're rich, you're privileged. What you're talking about this anti-Semitism? Anti-Semitism ended in 1945 with the Holocaust. What are you all complaining about? Get over it. And there's every once in a while you'll hear somebody actually say it, because there are a lot of people who are thinking it. And I think it's that mentality that exists on college campuses of this double standard, where you've had a lot of, I've seen it, you've had a lot of Jewish students who weren't really active in Jewish life or Jewish affairs, and maybe they were active in certain progressive or even leftist organizations, kind of had an awakening and realized, oh, these people, they're not just talking about Israel, they're talking about me. Right, and they're talking about Jews in general. And it's kind of woken up, I think, especially in the American Jewish community, of where do we fit politically going forward, right? Where do our identities fit? And the last thing I'll mention is that ADL, we are very much a First Amendment organization. We believe in free speech. We're not trying to limit people's speech, because we argue hate speech can be combated using better speech and explaining why people are hateful, right, and condemning certain speech. But what's interesting is looking at, a lot of universities have student codes of conduct in terms of protesting, in terms of what's allowed, what's not allowed. A lot of student codes of conduct have been broken at a lot of universities over the last few months. And a lot of universities are really not, some are doing well, and I want to be very commendable to them, but a lot are not doing really well in adhering and enacting those student codes when it comes to Jewish students. So we've seen a blatant double standard happen on a lot of college campuses.
And what you just described really depicts I would say, the unraveling of guardrails in our society, whether it's moral guardrails, ethic guardrails, disciplinary guardrails, seeing how people are just absolutely confused as to what it is that is expected. We have to have whole standards. If we don't have high standards, we're not going to be able to advance as a society. That's just the reality of things. I don't know what else to really put out there. And when it comes to this, what I see is a dual threat, and maybe you can comment on that too. But one thing I'm fearful of is not just the hateful sentiment that is being directed at Jews, but also just the sheer ignorance about Israel, about the state of Israel, about the history. I mean, there's a whole history, obviously, with regards to U.S.-Israel relations and all the. I was in a class with Professor Olson. We were talking about essentially intelligence, about the Mossad, and about the things that, while not everything is perfect, when it comes to security and all that, it's so essential. And to see so many people miss that is truly unfortunate. So I'd like to ask you, how do you combat this sort of dual threat of ignorance and hate, and maybe perhaps a combination of those two?
Yeah, it's an uphill battle, to say the least, because what makes, I've been focusing understandably, a lot of attention right now on far left anti-Semitism in terms of what's going on. And I think it's interesting. There would be some people in our society who would argue there's not anti-Semitism on the left. I don't know what you're talking about. It's all Donald Trump's fault. It's all the neo-Nazis' fault. It's the march to the right. And I tell people, no, like that's true. ADL, like, we're fighting far right anti-Semitism definitely still exists. But the last few months have shown perfectly to American society what does left-wing anti-Semitism look like, right? And so, in terms of how to combat it, it's going to have to be a multi-pronged approach, and this is what organizations like ADL are doing, which is holding universities accountable, making sure that free speech is allowed on campus. So if you have an anti-Israel speaker on campus, which they're allowed to do, you have also pro-Israel speakers on campus, and they're not shut down because it hurts people's feelings, or they don't like what they're saying, or they call them fascist, or whatever name that they, baby killers, or whatever other names they want to, and have to shut that down. That's not what university is supposed to be about. All right? It's supposed to be about an exchange of ideas, and part of discussion and part of democracy is hearing things you don't like and understanding that that's part of debate and not shutting down immediately because you hear one thing that's incorrect. So I think it's a culture, it's a big cultural issue. It goes beyond politics. I think there's a societal issue that I think, and it's not just kids, but it's adults too. We don't do a very good job listening to other people that disagree with us, or we don't let people finish. Because heaven forbid we were to hear something that is horrible and horrendous, and we don't like it, and we have to shut it down because it makes us feel bad. That's not how democracy works, right? And I look at kind of that dual threat of how do you combat it. Part of it is I mean, the facts are out there, right? But you have a lot of students who it blows my mind just hearing, for instance, like there are a lot of students, especially those who are anti-Israel, like they wake up and they think Jews just moved to Israel in 1948. Like not, and I love the fact that all this has been going on during Christmas time. I saw a lot of posts on Facebook, and it was brilliant. And it's like you're celebrating the birth for Christians. You're celebrating the birth of Jesus, who was Jewish and who was in the land of Israel 2,000 years ago. Right? Jews didn't wake up one day and say, "Oh, I think we're going to move to mandate Palestine in 1948, and this is going to be our land now." So I mean, it's the narrative is just especially those on the far left. It is just so misguided, right? And I'll be the first one to say, like, there are things about the Israeli government I don't like. There are certain actions the Israeli military has taken throughout its history that I don't like, right? But like, just the basic facts of like Jewish connection to the land of Israel, it goes back thousands and thousands of years. And I think there are just a lot of kids who they don't know about that, or they pick up a few TikTok videos or see things on Instagram. They say, "Oh, well, I'm an expert now. I know everything that needs to know about this," when in fact they don't. It's shocking to see the level of hubris amongst a lot of like young individuals, or they take one class on Middle East studies and they think they know that they are experts in this field when they haven't, or they probably heard it from one side and probably from a professor who wasn't that pro-Israel to begin with. It's a challenge, and it gets ingrained. And the tough part is, once it's ingrained in an individual, it's really hard to root out misinformation and sometimes flat out lies to give them like a real clear, basic understanding of showing this is, these are good things Israel's done. These are bad things Israel's done. These are good things Palestinians have done. These are bad things that Palestinians have done. Right? I mean, and understanding that it's two peoples fighting over one land and have been for decades, and trying to figure out how to resolve that. Not these people are illegitimate, wipe them off the planet, or this country that's been around for 75 years, I can just snap my fingers and they'll disappear completely. Those are pipe dreams, and it's not going to happen.
I appreciate the bluntness that you bring. And when it comes to learning, I mean, I'm always learning all the time. And I will admit that in terms of areas of interest on foreign policy and all, this is an area that I need to learn more about. I will be perfectly honest. I'm going to say it right here on this podcast. And I don't think anyone should be afraid to say that they want to learn more. They want to be curious. And that's one of the things that I hope that Hope ADL does too, which is, feeding into that curiosity that people have in terms of learning about Israel, about the Jewish people. When you mentioned TikTok, I mean, that's TikTok and learning never go together in one sentence. So I'm not surprised that there is this large disconnect here between learning and specifically I say it's a device. I mean, literally is a device. We were learning about this stuff from TikTok, which also it's a whole other security threat, but that's a whole other discussion there. And this is relatively new news, and I'm not sure if you've had some time to take a look. But one of the things that former Speaker Pelosi recently talked about was how there's a possibility that that foreign adversaries, notably like Russia, and I wouldn't rule out China and Iran and all those actors too, that these adversaries are playing some role in trying to exacerbate these divisions within our country. And I just want to make a quick comment and say, I mean, how cruel is that to be able to take advantage of something that is far more than just a political issue or a foreign policy issue, something that goes down into deep moral issues and of morality, of ethics, to exploit that for more evil. I mean, it's crazy. But I just want to ask if you think that there's definitely a big possibility that that's also happening too, as we see these kinds of these protests and riots and all that.
Yeah. So, I mean, I can say from ADL's perspective, we can't confirm those reports and looking into it. What I can say, though, is if that were happening, I wouldn't be surprised because literally when I say literally the day after, literally on October 8th, there were anti-Israel protesters out on streets, on college campuses, celebrating what happened on October 7th. I mean, that's sickening in itself, right? But a lot of the material that was coming out, I have a really hard time believing was organic or came from 18, 19, 20-year-olds. Or in some cases, protests were happening on high school campuses, so even younger, 14 to 18-year-olds. I have to imagine some of these tactics that some of these young students are learning, the material that they're getting has to be coming from somewhere. It has to be coming from adult audiences, and I wouldn't be shocked if it came from international groups or other countries, nation states, nations that don't like Israel, right, or have issues with Israel. I mean, I can't confirm, like from ADL's perspective, I can't confirm if those stories are true. But if a story uncovered that, for instance, anti-Israel, I mean, there are a lot of anti-Israel student groups on campus. But if the New York Times or the Washington Post reported one day that evidence has shown that they were getting materials from groups linked to Hamas or Hezbollah, I would be shocked. I'm going to be shocked one bit.
We need to get Professor Olson on the case, or maybe he'll recruit us.
Yes, exactly. Yes, look into it. I mean, it's and ADL. We do track a lot of these groups, right? But I mean, like it would take another level of like really going deep and saying where are they getting their money from, where are they getting talking points from, where are they getting materials from? Because there's a lot of things that I've seen that it's very intricate and very complex that I have a hard time believing. I try to give the benefit of the doubt to college students. There are a lot of very smart individuals out there, but a lot of this material comes from. I have to imagine it's coming from some outside source. Yeah, so it'd be really interesting to look into. And the thing that gets me to Sherman is the fact that it is Hamas is a U.S. designated terrorist organization. Right now, we have free speech. If you want to support Hamas and say you like Hamas, that's your right to do so. But these kids, and I call them kids on these college campuses, they're getting really, really close to the line in terms of support for a U.S. designated terrorist organization. They may not realize what they're doing and the implications, but if they were to take a next step and find out they tried bringing a Hamas speaker to campus or they were receiving funds from a nefarious organization that's connected to a terrorist organization, now you're breaking the law. And these kids are getting really, really close to crossing the line. But it's one of the things I try to point out to people is you might have issues with Israel. That's fine. I get that. But we've seen like flat out support for Hamas and Hezbollah and People's Front for the Liberation of Palestine at a lot of these protests. And it starts scratching your head and saying, where are these kids getting their information? Where are they getting their stuff from? And do they know what they're really supporting or do they not?
There's saying, of course, from the national security world, we're protecting against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And I would say that's part of the multifaceted issue that we have to confront. So I props to the people in national security who are working on this. I'm sure a number of them are working on it. Of course, I don't have confirmation. As you were saying, I share the same view with you that while I don't have specific confirmation, but I'm sure that there's absolutely a security priority here when it comes to people supporting groups that are designated as terrorist groups. One question on the state of Israel self-defense. I mean, what sort of implications do you see when it comes to this attack? If we just focus on the nature of the conflict, but what are the general implications of the attack and the subsequent attacks on both sides in terms of where you think you see the security for the state of Israel, and I guess just any other implications you want to add to that?
Yeah, the thing I'll mention is that Israel's military is top notch. Their intelligence agencies are top notch, not because there's something special about them. It honestly comes down to because they have to be. Israel would not have existed for 75 years and continue to exist if it did not have a powerful military or a powerful intelligence service. Right? Throughout its history, they've had nation states, still to a certain extent with Iran. Right? They have various terrorist organizations that would love nothing more to see Israel than wiped off the map. Right. And so part of that is it's ingrained in Israeli society. It's ingrained in Israeli culture that security is top notch. And I know, and I can't remember, I know it was a realist scholar who argued here in America, we're fortunate, we're surrounded by two gigantic oceans, and we have nations to the north and south who are buddies of us, more or less. being on this side of the globe, we don't have to worry about certain things. Now, security is still important for the United States, don't get me wrong, but Israel is in a neighborhood where they are surrounded literally on all sides by forces that want to see them wiped off the face of the map. And as a result of that, defense is key. I mean, it's why here in Israel, the vast majority of people in society, the exceptions being like those who are very Orthodox or maybe those who are or Arab citizens of Israel, if you are an Israeli Jewish citizen, if you are a member of the Druze community, you are required to serve in the IDF. And I can't remember the exact numbers. I believe it's now 2.5 years for men, and I think 1.5 or 2 years for women, roughly about that. So almost everyone in Israeli society goes through military service, right? Or they know somebody who is currently serving, even right now, whether it be in Gaza or protecting Israel's western or northern border, right? So security is paramount to Israel. And it's some of the protests that I've seen or some of the comments from public officials of, well, why is Israel bombing Gaza and why are they doing this? Like you would have thought if hearing from certain detractors, you would have thought Israel just woke up on October 8th and said, you know what, let's go bomb Gaza. Let's go shoot rockets into Lebanon to against Hezbollah, right? Israel didn't want this war. And I think there are a lot of people who, they don't like hearing that, but it's true. And in fact, there was a ceasefire from the 2021 war between Israel and Hamas that Hamas decided to break. And what October 7th, I think, will represent for Israeli history and Jewish history was just when we were getting comfortable, especially in Israel, right? Understanding that it's like, oh, well, Hamas isn't going to, there's no way they have the capability of doing an attack on that scale. And they did it on October 7th. It shocked a lot of Israelis. And a lot of Israelis, I think, woke up and they're still processing it and looking and saying, security is still paramount in Israel, right? And understanding that, yes, Israel has a powerful military and their intelligence agencies are vital and critical. And generally speaking, it's a safe place to live in Israel. You wouldn't think of that watching the news, but it really shook, I think, Israeli society to the core, recognizing that they are still susceptible to that level of terrorist attack that happened on October 7th.
It's shocking to me how many people just want to put a simple solution. They just simplify everything. They say, oh, we just need to have a ceasefire. As you said, Hamas broke that ceasefire. And there have been other attempts too. That was just the only attempt. Foreign policy really comes to war. I really believe that we need people in high level society who understand how complex war and foreign policy is. We cannot have people who simply say that, oh, you just need to solve this. Well, congratulations to these people who think that they're heroes, but that's not going to solve anything. And it's astonishing to me. We were talking about a bit about ignorance and all. I mean, this is ignorance at a far different scale, but it still boggles my mind. And I wonder when people will wake up and realize that, the problems in our world are not as simple. If they were simple, I think they would have been solved already. And I just want to ask, what do you think of these calls to try and simplify the solution?
Yeah, in a way, it is. In an odd way, I do agree with them to a certain extent that it is a simple problem. And the problem is, and you can look at all the factors from the Israeli side, the Palestinian side, this history, that history. It really boils down to, to be as objective as I possibly can be. It really comes down to two groups of people who both have legitimate claims to the same piece of land. And how are those two people going to get along? And how are they going to divide the land? How are they going to share the land, right? I mean, that's essentially what the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is all about and has been for really since Israel's founding, right? And for people who, it just gets on me, even me personally, but it just gets on my nerves. Well, it's like, well, they want to go back in history and say, well, this shouldn't have happened and that shouldn't have happened. Like, yeah, you can play that game all day. Unless there's a time machine that I don't know about that somebody has, we're not going back in time. Right? We can't go back to the 1940s, right, to end stop World War II. We can't go back to the 50s or the Six-Day War in the 60s, right? There are things that happen. It's all going to end up right back here, which is how we're going to solve the current problem. And understanding that it is complex, it is very emotional. Emotions now are on both sides are incredibly raw with the current war that's taking place. And so it is the basic problem is simple. It's everything surrounding it. that is complex, and the history is complex, right? And going forward, even if peace were to exist between the Israelis and Palestinians tomorrow, it doesn't mean the conflict's done. Right? It's going to take a while for that peace. Hopefully, and I say that hopefully, I want to see peace in that region. Whenever that does happen, it's going to take a while for it to really settle when that day ever comes.
Amen to that. Let's look at ADL now. And I'm confident, especially since we've known each other since the Bush School, I know that you're so capable of speaking to others. I saw it firsthand when we were knocking on doors. I knew firsthand that this is a man who knows how to connect with people. And so I'm not surprised that you're in the important role that you are in right now. And so I'd like to ask you a little bit about the founding of ADL, if you can, because I know there's a man named Sigmund Livingston who is the founder of ADL. In terms of the ADL, can you describe first a bit about Sigmund Livingston's vision and what you think the approach is when it comes to ADL's view on how to combat anti-Semitism? Just walk through kind of the basic tenets, if you don't mind.
I would be happy to. So, speaking about Sigmund Livingston, I'm sitting here in Chicago, where our Midwest office is headquartered. Sigmund Livingston was actually born and raised in Bloomington, Illinois, so a couple hours drive south of Chicago. And it just so happened I worked with the local Jewish community there. We had a presentation and kind of an all-day event set for October of last year. And we had this planned out like 6 months prior. So we ended up, and this was in light of what happened during October 7th. So me going there, it was my colleague and I who went there that day. It took on a whole new meaning. And part of our day actually was going to the gravesite where Sigmund Livingston and his family were buried and showing our respects there. And it took on a whole new meaning for me in my work in terms of this organization that Livingston founded now over 110 years ago. I tell people I don't know if he would be proud or be disappointed that ADL still exists today. And I say that like proud, I think, in terms of how massive organization has turned and all the work that we do, but disappointed in the sense that there's still a need for ADL. And October 7th, the post-October 7th world we live in has shown clearly, even for Jews who weren't that active to begin with, that anti-Semitism is still a problem. And so, long story short, ADL was founded in 1913, founded right here in Chicago. We are now an international nonprofit organization. But Sigmund's vision, and still remains our mission statement today at ADL, which is to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and to secure justice and fair treatment for all. So oftentimes people know ADL as a Jewish civil rights group, which we are, to be fair. But in reality, we're really an anti-hate organization in the sense that we're not just taking on civil rights cases, but we do everything from educating the next generations of Americans about tolerance and inclusivity. We do investigation. So I talked about us tracking various hate groups, extremist groups on the far left, far right. We have analysts day in and day out whose job is to monitor these groups. We do a lot of advocacy work at the local level, the national level, state level, advocating for bills that will help promote a more tolerant society. We have very close connections with law enforcement across the United States, and we do various trainings for them. Right, so we do a lot of different aspects, and we take a real multi-pronged approach to combating hate, specifically anti-Semitism. But of course, we're going to address all forms of hatred. Because Sigmund, his vision, and our CEO's vision today, Jonathan Greenblatt, is that American Jews would not be safe unless all marginalized groups in our society were safe. Which is why we speak out against racism and transphobia and homophobia, xenophobia, bias, bigotry that take place. Either we're going to take a lead as ADL, or we're going to work with our partners and provide backup and say, how can we help you in this specific case of hate?
That's so great to hear the camaraderie that you can build and the things you mentioned, the multiple people who are involved in all levels of society. I think that's a really great example of what we can do as a society. We can't just focus on only elections. We can't just focus on just advocacy. We have to do it on all levels. So I appreciate that approach that you shared about Sigmund and really the vision. I concur with what you said. I think he would be, obviously you want anti-Semitism to end, but at the same time, I'm sure he'd be smiling seeing people like you who are doing this important work. Reflecting on solutions. So, Trent, what sort of things do you want to see in terms of changes in our society or bills or anything that you want to add in terms of how we combat anti-Semitism and how we move forward to a better place in our political environment, but also our social environment as well?
Yeah. So, I mean, no, it's a fantastic question. I can tell you that, and I have to remind myself because I do this work day in and day out. There's not one bill, there's not one measure, there's not one initiative that's going to end hate or end anti-Semitism, right? It's anti-Semitism has been in existence for over 2,000 years, right? It's going to take, I have people that ask me, it's like, well, ADL's been around for 100 years. How haven't you guys solved anti-Semitism yet? And I'm like, well, it's been around for about 2,000 years. We had a late start. I have a lot of catch up to do. We've only been around for 100. So, it's been around for over 2,000. So, we got a lot of catch up to do there. But one thing I would love to see, if I had a magic wand and I could wave it, is the stereotypes that the average American still has about Jewish individuals, whether it comes to money, whether it comes to power, whether it comes to secrecy, whether it comes to mannerisms that Jews have, things like that. I think the average American, and I say this as someone who converted to Judaism, so I remember what it's like not being Jewish, is that I think a lot of people would be shocked to know how diverse the Jewish community really is in terms of religious observance, in terms of political views, in terms of ethnic backgrounds, right? Not all Jews are white. I mentioned that at the top of our podcast, right? That you have Jews from the Middle East, you have Jews from Ethiopia, you have Jews from China, you have Jews from Latin America, right? We're a very multiracial group of individuals. And if I had one magic wand, I wish the stereotypes that people still had about Jews didn't exist anymore. Because one of the things that we teach at ADL, it's called our pyramid of hate. And it's a visualization of understanding how hate exists and how it manifests throughout society. And at the very base of the pyramid, and we argue at the very base of any type of hatred, are biased attitudes, is stereotyping, are things that what are people thinking and feeling about a particular group of people. And if you can eliminate that, if you can eliminate stereotypes, and if you can eliminate horrible ideas that people have about Jews or things like that, there wouldn't be need for hatred. The conspiracy theories that continue to exist and take hold for a lot of Americans, they wouldn't apply. People wouldn't believe them because they didn't have those preconceived stereotypes, those prejudices that people had that they then built on by watching false videos on YouTube, or an uncle at a Thanksgiving dinner makes a joke and they're like, yeah, it's funny because it's true, when in fact it's not true, right? By eliminating the stereotyping, I think we can eliminate a lot of hatred in our society. And I think the way to go about doing that is having conversations, explaining, maybe it's through media, through news, or through movies, or through music, not propelling those stereotypes over and over again, and showing really how diverse and how wide-ranging the Jewish community really is. And I think it'd open a lot of eyes for a lot of Americans.
Well said, my friend. Well, this gets into the reflection phase of our conversation. As you know, this podcast is based on Washington's farewell address and the principles that come out of that. So we look at patriotism, faith, national unity, education, fiscal responsibility, and civility. Which values of those do you think are most applicable to our conversation today, and just connections that you would make between the work that you do and those values?
I think several of them can relate. And actually, in speaking about George Washington, there's a synagogue in Rhode Island, and I visited. It's called Toro Synagogue, which is actually the oldest continuing synagogue in the United States. It's been around since even before the nation's founding. They have a museum there, and they actually have a letter that George Washington wrote to his local Jewish community, essentially like showing support for that community and showing that, yes, even though you're Jews, you may not fit into the specific mold of America, that you're still Americans, right? And it's what makes America great is our diversity. We come from a lot of different walks of life, but we are joined together by a civic nationalism that exists. And so really, I think you could apply almost any of Washington's farewell address points, whether it is patriotism, the idea that we talk about different stereotypes about dual loyalty, for instance, that a lot of Americans think Jews aren't as loyal as they should be, when in fact Jews have served in every American war, going back to the Revolutionary War, that Jews have given countless numbers of hours and millions of dollars to charitable organizations that have nothing to do with Judaism, but about repairing the world, repairing our country. I think humility could still be there, where in the sense that I think people look at like Jewish stereotypes and they think, oh, well, Jews must think that they're better than other people. And in fact, we don't. We largely don't, right? Or that Jews are powerful, or this all, out to take over the world kind of mentality, when we're not. Right. So I think you can take almost any one of Washington's farewell address points and argue that, that Jews, that American Jews are just as loyal or just as patriotic or just as humble as any American group.
Indeed. Amen to that. I'll end with a couple of points, which I hope will be also part of every American's endeavor in terms of learning more. First is, I went to the Holocaust Museum in DC. I walked out of there not just having learned more about what happened during the Holocaust. I learned about just just about pure evil and what happened to the Jewish people. I mean, it's hard to describe in words, so I won't beleaguer this point. However, I highly recommend people go to the Holocaust Museum in DC or any great sites to learn about the Holocaust. I mean, it really is such an eye-opening experience, and you really see. You don't just learn about Nazism; you learn about Nazism as an evil. The second point I'll make is, at Texas A&M, I had the great opportunity to listen to Dr. Jacob Eisenbach, who is a Holocaust survivor. At the time, he was, I think, around 94, 95 years old. I think he's still alive today. And he's just, he even has secrets on how to live long. So there you go. Right? It's a great talk for people to listen to when they can. But he spoke to the audience, and hearing his story was so inspirational. That was my first time hearing from a Holocaust survivor. And the title of the book he wrote is called "Where You Go, I Go." And I bring that title up because I really think that's the kind of work that you are doing, Trent. You are not only being an advocate for ADL, but I think you are staying alongside people who felt unexplainable hatred that happened after October 7th attacks. You are there to amplify people's voices so that people can be heard and that people can, again, learn and be curious about the Jewish people and about Israel. I just think it's a very fitting connection there that I want to make with you, and really just to express my sincere thank you to you for the work that you do. And I hope that we build a larger coalition, just in general, ADL with other, as you mentioned, all those other stakeholders in this effort. So what's the best way to learn more about ADL and about the work that you do?
Absolutely. So folks can go on our website, so adl.org, and it's a pretty extensive website in terms of learning about our history, in terms of our work. We have tons of resources out there for folks to understand about anti-Semitism and bias and hatred. And one thing I would suggest is, even going past ADL, that if folks want to learn more about Jews or Judaism, reaching out to your local synagogue, asking to attend a service, or if you have Jewish neighbors or Jewish friends, asking if you can attend a Passover Seder, right, or a Hanukkah celebration, right, or having a conversation, like really having key moments and having conversations with people that you're probably already connected with who are Jewish, and understanding what it means to be Jewish, and understanding, from a Jewish perspective, what this post-October 7th world that we're living in, what it means, and asking them about anti-Semitism, not just after October 7th, but really the last 5 or 6 years in terms. And you'll hear some shocking things about fear, but also about resilience, and understanding that, there's a phrase in Judaism we have that this too shall pass. And we say that about horrible events that have taken place, and the tough times that Jews are going through right now, whether in Israel or the United States or worldwide. It's a rough patch we're going through, but this too shall pass, and better days will be ahead.
Well said, my friend. Trent, thank you again for being on the show, and I really appreciate our conversation today. Thank you so much.
Absolutely, Sherman. Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you all so much for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it, make sure to subscribe to Friends and Fellow Citizens for more content. Have a great rest of your day, and remember, a day in America is always better when we are with our friends and fellow citizens.